New videos every day.
So I'm John Breeding. It's Tuesday, February 8th in Austin, Texas. It's a warm day in a cycle of cold and warm. So we're grateful for these Indian summer days in Austin, Texas. But last week I was in Washington, D.C. It was very, very cold. In fact, on the flight up there, I ended up spending the night on the floor in the airport in Charlotte, North Carolina, because all the flights into Washington, D.C. were canceled. I made it the next morning, though, for what we called a battle in Gaithersburg, suburb outside of D.C., in a hotel where the FDA hearings on the reclassification of electroshock machines were held on January 27th and 28th. This is a very, very important occasion, illustrative of the issue of psychiatric repression, a very important specific battle around the issue of electroshock. I wrote up a full report on this that's available on the internet, and you're welcome to email me at my website, john@wildestcolts.com, if you have trouble finding it and want me to send it to you. I'm going to give you an abbreviated version just now. The stated mission was for this panel appointed by the FDA to make recommendations to the FDA about whether to keep electroshock machines classified in Class 3, which means high-risk, dangerous devices, or reclassified to Class 2, which means they're relatively safe and not dangerous, like, for example, a wheelchair. The industry, the psychiatric industry, the electroshock industry, has been pushing for reclassification. This was a very important meeting. It was a very high-stakes meeting, as a win for the industry would mean that they're home free in terms of challenges around electroshock. A win for us, and us being me and my allies, I'm part of the Coalition for the Abolition of Electroshock in Texas. You can see our views on endofshock.com. A win for our side would mean that the devices remain Class 3, that the shock industry is required to provide sufficient research on safety and effectiveness to either reassure the FDA that they are indeed safe and effective, or failure to do so would ultimately mean the phasing out and end of electroshock as we know it. This is obviously what I think needs to happen. Electroshock is in the same category as insulin coma shock, as lobotomy, all brought forward in the 40s and practiced heavily in the 50s. On into the 60s, insulin coma shock, thrown out, lobotomy, banned, notorious, electroshock somehow continued. That's a long story. The short story here is about the hearing. I characterize this whole thing as Groundhog Day deja vu all over again. You know the Groundhog Day Bill Murray movie, right? As electroshock survivor and researcher Linda Andre lays out in detail in her remarkable book, Doctors of Deception, what they don't want you to know about electroshock. Best book on the market for those who really want to look at the story. The other best one is the Electroshock Quotationary by Leonard Roy Frank, which can be downloaded for free on endofshock.com. But as Linda lays out in Doctors of Deception, ever since 1976, when the Medical Devices Amendment Act was put forward that gave the FDA regulatory power over medical devices, the law has said that the industry is supposed to do a pre-market approval and prove their safety and efficacy. The FDA has bent over backwards decade after decade to avoid holding the industry accountable. This is how we got to the point today. As Linda Andre lays out in her book, and as I told the committee, the fact that this hearing even happened was a victory of public relations over science. In any event, the testimony of our allies was inspiring and compelling. But sitting through hours of psychiatric experts on the panel, 5 psychiatrists, they dominated the conversation. It was very troubling. I felt very discouraged. I thought we were going to lose. It was an Orwellian nightmare, really, from George Orwell's book, 1984, this whole thing of newspeak and doublespeak, where reality is not allowed to be seen and held in conversation. I want to give you 4 points about this Orwellian universe at the FDA electroshock hearings. Number one, there was a consistent rejection and disrespect of survivor testimony that was negative about shock. The psychiatrists would call it anecdotal and dismiss it. Their own anecdotes would be characterized as expert clinical experience. Their anecdotes about the people they saw it help. But they would dismiss the electroshock survivors' testimony. Very frustrating. Number two, relevant data on electroshock danger or effectiveness was consistently rejected as pointing to the older way of shock. So the part of the public relations campaign is that we now have newer, safer electroshock. What that really means is code for, don't look at what's really going on. Believe our public relations line that we're safe now. What is different is now they use general anesthesia and muscle relaxants so you don't get as many broken teeth and broken bones. But the damage and the danger is due to the electricity into the brain that causes brain damage. Cell death to the heat and electrical activity. Thousands, millivolts of natural activity in the brain. Hundreds of volts sent in via these electroshock devices. Brain damage, cell death. Breaching of blood-brain barrier, toxic flow into the brain, cell death. Glucose overactivity due to the seizure, cell death. It's a reason why the rest of medicine is determined to prevent seizures, because it's known that they cause damage and that the effect is cumulative. Let's not talk about that according to these psychiatrists. Number three, another key strategy for discounting challenge has been used over the years by psychiatry in our struggle to challenge the iatrogenic effects of everything about psychiatry, most especially the drugs, right? So with the SSRI suicide connection. Oh, it's not the SSRIs, it's the mental illness called depression. They lost that battle. There's a black box warning on these drugs now. But that's the way to discount everything. You see so-called relapse. You see a failure to sustain any benefit through electroshock. That's not treatment failure. That's the progression of the illness, the trajectory of the disease. So you have maintenance electroshock that's needed, just like lifelong chronic drug use is necessary to treat the illness, which is supposedly a brain disease. No evidence of that, but it's a great denial mechanism to avoid having to confront any failure, because all they have to offer is drugs, 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 and in the treatment of next resort, electroshock. Lastly, there's the issue of coercion. That's the elephant in the room. That's the hot potato that the panel didn't want to talk about, even though they were forced to a little bit. They want forced electroshock, which is going on all around the country except in Texas. They want surrogate consent, where someone won't consent for electroshock for themselves, but their guardian or their loved one can consent for them once they're declared incapacitated. Coercion is the hidden thing that's always there in psychiatry. They actually talked during the hearing about the use of electroshock for so-called catatonia, as if that was a benevolent thing to do for something that was in someone who's in a life-threatening condition. They refused to make the connection that you can't have consent, that what an assault it is to take someone who's basically mute and unresponsive and electroshock their brain. It's torture. So as I've said, from my perspective, observing this thing, I didn't feel so good. I was discouraged. The panel conversation had been dominated by the psychiatrists, and I failed to realize that we would convince every one of the non-industry people on the panel that the machines were dangerous and did not merit reclassification. All 5 psychiatrists, there were 5 psychiatrists on the panel, 2 or 3 of them did shock, the others referred for shock. So 5 psychiatrists. A pharmacologist who was very psychiatric. a machine industry representative who really believed in electroshock machines, and an anesthesiologist, who should also be considered an industry person, because guess what? 2 or 3 electroshocks a week, 2 or 3 anesthesiology sessions a week. So all those 8 industry people voted to reclassify these machines when it came to a vote on electroshock for depression, which is the main thing that it's justified for, according to the industry. But guess what? There were 10 non-industry people on the panel: neurologists, psychologists, patient rep, consumer rep, biostatistician, people like that, ophthalmologists. Guess what? All 10 of them voted to keep the devices in Class 3. The public relations campaign of psychiatry and the industry around electroshock over the last 30 years, and in this hearing, did not convince one of them. The astounding thing is that these true believers, despite decades of PR and hours of intense effort in this hearing, failed to sway even one of the non-industry people. All 10 voted to keep the machines Class 3. Neurologist David Good pointed to a huge disconnect between the reports of the psychiatric clinicians on the panel and the actual research, and challenged the profession of psychiatry to meet the same standard as other medical specialties. One psychiatrist on the panel, Dr. McDonald, assured us all that his work really was about the practice of medicine. This is the big lie, and this is the big truth, that psychiatry is different from every other branch of medicine, which deals with scientific evidence of disease. Psychiatry is all pseudoscience, it's smoke and mirrors. It's a theory and opinion that leads to the justification of drugging millions and millions and millions of people, including children, and electroshocking about 100,000 a year. We didn't win everything. There was a lot of talk that sounded troubling. We got a lot of work to do, and you can read my report if you're interested in that. But of the 10 non-industry people on the panel, we got a 100% positive result, and that is remarkable. The committee chair, neurologist Thomas Brott, in the Washington Post the next day, January 29, 2011, you can find an article summarizing the hearing in the Washington Post by David Brown. Panel chairman Thomas Brott, a neurologist at the Mayo Clinic, said he was amazed that essentially no research had been done on ECT's effects using functional MRI, EEG studies, or autopsy examinations. That's because the industry has deliberately avoided that which would provide evidence of brain damage. And it's the job of the FDA to hold them accountable to that. Instead, the FDA has deliberately not held them accountable and has even started doing their research and work for them. If the FDA does the right thing, they will now take the advice of this panel, keep the machines in Class 3, say it's up to the industry to provide double-blind, controlled, large numbers of subject studies with meaningful criteria of brain damage, meaningful criteria of memory loss, meaningful criteria of effectiveness beyond the doctor's opinion or the patient's temporary opinion under the effects of a closed head injury. This is a huge point. Lastly, I want everyone to know that the public testimony, including all the written submissions, made all the difference in the world. Several panel members referred to it. They could not shine on the fact that large numbers of electroshock survivors called it a horror, said it was terribly traumatic and distressing, and that they had profound memory loss and other effects as a result. However hard the psychiatrists tried to deny that and shine it on, the 10 non-industry people acknowledged it. So they need to keep hearing from you. Finally, my work is challenging psychiatric oppression. One source on oppression theory for me is the reevaluation counseling community. And they have a term called targeted for destruction, that there's groups that are targeted for destruction. They're the specific targets of different forms of oppression. For example, young black men are targeted for oppression through racism as institutionalized in our current so-called criminal justice system and the war on drugs. In this case, so-called mental patients are targeted for destruction. That's how you end up with an anatomy of an epidemic as laid out by Robert Whitaker in his 2010 book, right? That's how you end up with large numbers of people on disability. That's how you end up with people dying on 25 years earlier on average than the rest of the general population because they've been taking these psych drugs long term. That's how you end up with people being devastated by electroshock, which is the treatment of next resort after the failed drugs and the damage caused by the drugs. This is an ugly business. Don't kid yourself. But that's what makes it remarkable that these powerful and courageous electroshock survivors stood up, testified, and make the difference. To go through that kind of trauma, that kind of terrifying assault, and then stand up to that is an awesome thing. Very inspiring to me. The article that I mentioned in the Washington Post by David Brown quoted Evelyn Scoggin, one of my favorite courageous, heroic electroshock survivors. I lost not only my memories of the time I was subjected to this torture, but I was robbed of almost all memories from about 2003, 2 years before treatment, to 2008, 3 years after treatment stopped. That's one story about someone who was severely traumatized by electroshock. Brown also told the bottom line. An expert panel advising the Food and Drug Administration decided Friday that electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, machines should undergo the same rigorous testing as new medical devices coming onto the market, a decision that could drastically affect the future of psychiatry's most controversial treatment. Let's hold them accountable. Let's push the FDA. Let's keep crying out the truth about electroshock. It's a horrific brain-damaging procedure. Always causes brain damage, always causes memory loss. Is never necessary, and sometimes causes death. Endofshock.com. Thank you.